We're going to turn to God's Word now, and we are nearing the end of our series in the book of Job here at the Corner Church, but we do still have 2 more sermons to go, and for today's reading, we're going to be exploring Job chapter 41, verses 1 to 34. And so if you have your Bible with you, you can turn there now, Job chapter 41, verses 1 to 34, and let's hear the word of the Lord together. The Lord said, "Can you pull in the Leviathan with a fishhook, or tie down his tongue with a rope? Can you put a cord through his nose, or pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he keep begging you for mercy? Will he speak to you with gentle words? Will he make an agreement with you for you to take him as your slave for life? Can you make a pet of him like a bird, or put him on a leash for your girls? Will traders barter for him? Will they divide him up among the merchants? Can you fill his hide with harpoons, or his head with fishing spears? If you lay a hand on him, you will remember the struggle and never do it again. Any hope of subduing him is false. The mere sight of him is overpowering. No one is fierce enough to rouse him. Who then is able to stand against me? Who has a claim against me that I must pay it? Everything under heaven belongs to me. I will not fail to speak of his limbs, his strength, and his graceful form. Who can strip off his outer coat? Who would approach him with a bridle? Who dares to open the doors of his mouth, ringed about with fearsome teeth? His back has rows of shields tightly sealed together. Each is so close to the next that no air can pass between. They are joined fast to one another. They cling together and cannot be parted. His snorting throws out flashes of light. His eyes are like the rays of dawn. Firebrands stream from his mouth. Sparks of fire shoot out. Smoke pours from his nostrils as from a boiling pot over a fire of reeds. His breath sets coals ablaze, and flames dart from his mouth. Strength resides in his neck. Dismay goes before him. The folds of his flesh are tightly joined. They are firm and immovable. His chest is hard as rock, hard as a lower millstone. When he rises up, the mighty are terrified. They retreat before his thrashing. The sword that reaches him has no effect, nor does the spear or the dart or the javelin. Iron he treats as straw, and bronze like rotten wood. Arrows do not make him flee. Sling stones are like chaff to him. A club seems to him but a piece of straw. He laughs at the rattling of the lance. His undersides are jagged potsherds, leaving a trail in the mud like a threshing sledge. He makes the depths churn like a boiling cauldron and stirs up the sea like a pot of ointment. Behind him, he leaves a glistening wake. One would think the deep had white hair. Nothing on earth is his equal, a creature without fear. He looks down on all that are haughty. He is king over all that are proud. And may the Lord add his blessing to the reading of his word. So we have a bit of an unusual tradition at our house. Every fall, early in the September, we sit down to watch the cheesy monster movie that came out a couple of years ago called The Meg. Has anyone out there ever heard of The Meg before? It's about this team of marine biologists who are trying to discover what lies at the bottom of the Marianas Trench, and they accidentally summon to the surface a megalodon shark. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, megalodon shark? Isn't that the species of gigantic shark that grew to over 34 feet long and had teeth the size of a man's hand? Haven't they been extinct for ages? And the answer is, well, they thought the megalodon was extinct, but like I say, these scientists encounter a living megalodon at the bottom of the Marianas Trench, and they unwittingly bring it up to the surface where it proceeds to wreak havoc on the coastline, destroying ships and devouring innocent bystanders. And, well, you'll just have to watch the show for yourself if you want to know how they finally end the megalodon's vicious rampage. But I realize it may raise an eyebrow or two for you to hear Pastor Dale admit that he has an annual tradition of watching this B-grade monster flick. So let me assure you that our fall Meg watching ritual started for a purpose. You see, 2018 was the year our middle child, Leland, moved out to go to university. And we have 3 kids at home, so this was the second one to move out. And it left our youngest child, Rachel, home alone with just the parents to keep her company. And if you grew up with 2 awesome siblings like she had, and then within a short span of a couple of years, suddenly everyone was gone but you, then you would be able to relate to how sad Rachel was the day we drove home from London, having dropped Leland off to study at the University of Western Ontario. She was really sad. So sad, in fact, that my dad instincts sort of kicked into high gear, and I thought, we need something to take our mind off of all of this sadness. And I'd heard about this silly monster movie that had just come out called The Meg. And so, without even thinking, I just said, I know what we're going to do, Rachel. We're going to go see The Meg tonight, which we did do. And it was the corniest, scary movie you could imagine. But somehow, after watching some oversized monster shark terrorize the coastline for 2 hours, somehow, strangely, we felt better. And ever since then, every fall, we watch The Meg together in commemoration of that day it helped us to deal with our sadness. But this is not a film review, it's a sermon. The only reason I'm telling you about The Meg today is because, strangely, The Meg is a movie about a terrifying sea monster, right? And watching it helped the Harris family deal with their sadness, okay? And, if I may, kind of, sort of, the very same thing is happening here in Job 41 today, where God tells Job about some mysterious sea creature called the Leviathan. And God does it in particular to help Job deal with his sadness, which it does do, actually. It helps him deal with his sadness by assuring him of the incredibly good news that God has put a leash on the Leviathan. Now, you might say to me, God has put a leash on the Leviathan. I mean, how on earth could that possibly be good news? And I'd say, well, to get it, you have to first get what the Leviathan actually is. Because I will admit that this is one of the most mysterious passages, certainly in the book of Job, and maybe even in the whole entire Bible itself, one of the most mysterious passages of all. And there have been no end of speculations about what God is actually describing here in Job 41 when he talks about the Leviathan. I mean, as far as we can tell, it is some sort of enormous sea monster or other. Its mouth is ringed about with fearsome teeth, it says in verse 41. Its scales are like tightly sealed plates of armor that no spear or harpoon can pierce, it says in verse 15. Smoke pours from its nostrils and fire flashes from its mouth. I mean, from the sounds of things, we are talking about a monster from the deep here that would make the Meg look like a guppy. And you kind of got to sort of wonder, what on earth is this thing? Now, there have been theories. Some people think that Job 41 is describing some specific water animal or another, like a crocodile maybe. That's actually the usual contender. It's a crocodile. Although no crocodile I've ever known breathes fire and has smoke pouring from his nostrils, okay? So if this is a crocodile, there is a whole lot of poetic license going on in this text. Once in a while, you come across the idea that the Leviathan is a reference to some prehistoric creature, like a dinosaur, basically. And so, there you go, kids. Kids, if you ever wondered if the Bible mentions the dinosaurs, Job 41 could quite possibly be one place where it does. I mean, it would certainly fit with the description, except that, I mean, no dinosaur I ever heard of actually breathes fire, right? And if God's goal is to help Job deal with his suffering, it's not clear to me how some discussion about some prehistoric animal that he'd never seen before would help him do that. And so, personally, I don't think Leviathan is a dinosaur either. If you want to know what I think that Leviathan is a mythical sea monster. A monster that Job would have heard about from the mythologies of the cultures all around him in the ancient Near East. A mythical monster that, although itself not real, it represents the powers of evil and chaos that are in the world and that seem hell-bent on trying to undo the world. And even though Leviathan itself is a mythical creature, those things it represents, right? The evil and the chaos, those things are hardly mythical. They are all too real. And the reason I think that Leviathan is a mythical creature that's meant to symbolize evil and chaos, the reason I think that is because, well, like I say, because that's exactly what Leviathan was in Job's culture. They called it Lotan sometimes, which in Hebrew comes out as Leviathan. Sometimes they called it Rachav, which means the fierce one, and sometimes they called it Yam, which just means the sea. And in the mythologies of the ancient Near East, Lotan was this terrifying, multi-headed monster that lived in the sea. And it represented the sea. And more than that, it represented all of the kinds of things that the sea can do, right? When the waves are high and the waves are stormy, if you know what I mean. All the chaos and the destruction that the sea was capable of. This is what the Bible seems to have in mind in all of the other places where it refers to the Leviathan. Because there are other places than just here in Job 41. In Psalm 74, verse 14, for instance, it says that God, and I quote, God crushed the heads of the Leviathan. And then in Isaiah 27, verse 1, it says, and again I'm quoting, that the Lord will punish the coiling serpent, the Leviathan, with his sword. He will slay the gliding Leviathan, the monster of the sea. And Job himself, earlier on in this book, in chapter 3, verse 8, like just as his world was descending into chaos, his family taken from him, his wealth destroyed, his health stolen from him, like while the waves of chaos were swirling all around him, so to speak, he said in chapter 3, verse 8, he said, May those who are ready to rouse Leviathan curse the day I was born. Because, you see, the chaotic evil that he was experiencing in that moment reminded him of the sea monster Leviathan. Because in Job's world, that's what the sea monster Leviathan represented: chaos and evil. And if you followed all of that, then maybe now you will see why it's such good news for us today to know that God has put a leash on Leviathan. Because if Leviathan represents all of the evil and the destruction and the chaos that seems hell-bent on destroying his good creation, if that's what Leviathan is, then the good news is that God has actually put a leash on those things too. He set a limit on the evil and the chaos. He's put a boundary on it, and it is not more powerful than God is. I mean, however terrifying Leviathan might seem to landlubbers like us, still, it is just a guppy in God's fishbowl, so to speak. And the evil and the chaos, it cannot do anything beyond the limit that God has placed on it. Can you draw out the Leviathan with a fishhook? God asks Job in verse 41. Can you put a rope in his nose or pierce his jaw with a hook? Will you make a pet of him like a bird or put him on a leash for your girls? He says. And I hope you'll notice there, God's using a series of rhetorical questions when he asks those things, right? Rhetorical questions, which are questions that don't really need an answer, because the question was really just a roundabout way of making the point. Like when God asks Job if he can draw in the Leviathan with a fishhook, Job doesn't need to say, well, no, God, actually, I can't do that, and I wouldn't even want to try. He doesn't have to say that, because the question itself is actually making that point for him. Right? That even though both God and Job both know that Job can't do that, the truth is God can. And so, in verse 5, when God says to Job, will you put a leash on Leviathan? The point there is that even though Job can't do that, God can. And he has. Well, Corner Church, we've been studying the book of Job for over 3 months now. This is our 13th sermon in this series. And here we are, finally getting God's answer to all of the questions that it has raised for us about evil and suffering. And why is there evil and suffering in the world? And what is God doing about the evil and the suffering? I mean, if you were wondering whether or not God was ever going to answer those questions, well, here's your answer. In this mysterious description of some mythical sea monster, and God's assurance to us that he has, in fact, put a leash on it. God has put a leash on Leviathan, which is to say that even though God doesn't explain why he allows evil or how he's going to bring good out of evil when it does happen, I mean, he certainly implies that he has a reason for it, and he certainly suggests that he can bring good out of it, but he doesn't tell Job why or how he's going to do that. All he says is simply to assure Job that he is still sovereign, even over Leviathan, even over everything that Leviathan represents. He is still sovereign, and he has actually set a limit on how far evil and chaos can go. He's leashed it. Of course, we didn't have to wait until chapter 41 to know that. I mean, think back to the beginning of this book. The beginning of this book, when Satan himself came into the throne room of heaven. Do you remember that? By the way, traditionally in Christian interpretations of Job, this reference to the Leviathan in chapter 41 has been taken as a symbolic description of Satan. Which I guess that kind of makes sense, right? If Leviathan is a symbol for chaos and evil, then of course the ultimate representative of evil, from a Christian perspective, the ultimate representative is Satan himself. And so you often come across the idea that this description of Leviathan here is God's way of talking to Job about Satan. Which, again, would make sense. Because if you recall how this book began, Satan came into the throne room of heaven, right? Do you remember that? And he started accusing Job of just being righteous for the sake of what he got out of it. And then, in order to prove that Satan was wrong, God permitted Satan to afflict Job with misery. And if you recall that moment, what did God say to Satan? He said, "Go ahead and take everything from him, Satan, but on the man himself you may not lay a finger." And then later, when Satan came back and said, well, he said, "Job stayed true to you, God, but that's only because you didn't let me touch him personally." Then what did God say? He said, "Okay, he's in your hands now, but you must spare his life." Do you see what's going on there? In chapters 1 and 2, Satan was not able to do anything whatsoever except what God permitted and allowed him to do. And even when he was allowed, still God set the limits on him. "Take his property, but you can't put a finger on him," said God. "Afflict his health, but you must spare his life," said God. Now, Corner Church, Satan is a liar and the father of lies. He is a murderer from the beginning. That's how the Bible says it. And he is prowling around like a roaring lion, looking for whom he can devour, is how it says it in another place. He is the enemy of our souls, and he is hell-bent on destroying God's good creation. Okay? Make no mistake about that. But if anything the book of Job has to say can be trusted, however evil he is, and again, make no mistake that he is diabolically evil, but still, however evil he is on a leash. And God is still sovereign over his world. There's a forest path that kind of runs along behind some houses near where I live. It's all forest on one side, and the yards of all the houses are on the other. And I often go down that path when I go for a run. And there's a dog. There's a dog lives in one of the yards along that path that is, well, let's just say it is quite zealous in guarding its property, if you know what I mean by that. And every time I go by, it explodes at me in a rage of barking. Every time. Has anyone ever had an experience like that? Where you come into a strange yard maybe, and there's a strange dog there that just goes bonkers barking at you? Well, what's the first thing you always check to see when that happens? Is that dog leashed? Right? Because even if the dog's serious about taking a chunk out of you, still, if it's leashed, then however savage it might seem, still you know that you are safe. Well, The dog living by the forest path near my place is not leashed per se, but it is fenced in, which is just as good. And that's why, even though I still get a reminder that I'm mortal every time I go by it, still, I'm always able to run past safely. Is this making sense to you? If so, then, Corner Church, the Leviathan in Job chapter 41 and everything it represents, the evil, the chaos, the sin, the death, the Satan, however terrifying Leviathan is, still the good news is that Leviathan is leashed. Can I tell you just exactly how we know that he is? Because some 1,200 years or so after Job, God himself came to us in the flesh, and God himself won the decisive and the final victory over Leviathan and everything it represents. His name was Jesus of Nazareth, if you haven't heard. And everywhere he went, the waves of chaos were always stilled. Quite literally, in fact. I mean, one time he was literally caught in a boat, in a storm, on the lake with his friends. And when it looked like the sea was going to drag them all down to the depths, this Jesus simply rose and he told the thrashing chaos of the sea to be calm and be still. And instantly it was. Well, you can't stand up to evil for long without drawing all kinds of the wrong kind of attention to yourself. And eventually that's what happened to this Jesus, because eventually the powers of evil had had enough. And so we seized him and we condemned him to death and we nailed him to a cross and hung him up in a public place to die. But Corner Church, I proclaim to you today that if you want bona fide proof that God really has placed a limit on the evil that Leviathan can inflict, all you need to do is to look to the cross. Because the cross is quite literally the limit, the boundary, the leash that God has placed on evil. The cross is. And I say that for two reasons. First, because in the cross, we see that God really is able to bring his good purposes out of the worst chaos that Satan may inflict on the world. I mean, after all, he brought our redemption out of the cross, didn't he? New creation, resurrection glory out of the evil of the cross. And if he did that with the cross, then what can't he do with the Leviathan-esque chaos that you or I might be facing today? Okay, so that's one, but even more than that, the cross itself is the limit that God has placed on evil and chaos in the world. Because through the cross, in the death of Jesus on the cross, we have God's sure word that the battle against Satan has literally been fought and won for us through the cross. Like, we have victory over the Leviathan itself in the death and resurrection of Jesus. This is why the Son of God came into the world, the Bible says in one place. This is why, so that he might destroy the works of the devil. End quote. And in another place it says it like this: he, Jesus, he died to destroy him who holds the power of death. That is the devil. Corner Church, as far as Christians are concerned, the devil is literally a defeated enemy. And the cross of Christ is literally the limit, the boundary, the leash that God has placed him on. And if I may, might I suggest to you that if you are in that place today where it really feels like the Leviathan has reared up its ugly head against you, okay, chaos and evil and spiritual attacks from the enemy, if you're facing those kinds of things today, the simplest and most powerful thing you can do today is simply and powerfully to claim the victory over evil that God has won for you in the cross. To say to God today, Lord, I believe that you are sovereign over the chaos. I believe that through your death and resurrection, the death and resurrection of Jesus, you have won the victory over it. And I know by the blood of Christ that Satan is a defeated enemy with no power and no authority and no influence whatsoever in my life. Friends, if you will do that, if we will do that, we may actually be startled to discover how powerfully God really has leashed the Leviathan in our lives.